The year was 1881, and deep within the rugged slopes of the Tennessee mountains stood a place that promised weary travelers warmth, food, and rest. Hollow Creek Inn, a modest wooden lodge built along a winding dirt road, was not grand by any means, but for those passing through the isolated region, it became a refuge against the unforgiving wilderness that surrounded it. What no one could foresee, what no one dared to imagine, was that for some of its guests, Hollow Creek Inn would become not a resting place, but a final destination. By the autumn of that year, whispers began spreading across local towns. Stories of travelers who checked in but were never seen again. Hunters wandering nearby spoke of an unsettling silence that fell over the inn after dusk. And stagecoach drivers, who often had no choice but to stop there, confided afterward that the very air around Hollow Creek seemed thicker, heavier, as though concealing something it refused to reveal. Yet, before it gained its sinister reputation, Hollow Creek Inn had been nothing more than a roadside refuge. Constructed in 1876 by a man named Elias Morton, the inn was meant to be a family business, an opportunity to draw income from the growing number of traders and settlers who journeyed through the region. The Tennessee mountains were treacherous, untamed, and unpredictable. Storms could sweep in without warning, and in winter, entire paths became impossible to cross. An inn along such a route was not just convenient, it was vital. The lodge itself was built of rough-hewn oak beams and local stone, with a wraparound porch that overlooked a narrow valley where fog often clung like a shroud. Inside there was nothing extravagant. 8 small rooms upstairs, each with a narrow bed and a window that opened onto the endless forest. Downstairs, a wide hearth dominated the common room, its fire providing more comfort than the thin ale or the watery stew that usually awaited guests. The scent of smoke mixed with the tang of old pine, lingering in every corner. Elias Morton, the proprietor, was known as a quiet man. Strong, broad-shouldered, with hands calloused by carpentry, he had a reputation for being stern but fair. Alongside him worked his younger sister, Clara, barely 20 years of age, with a sharp tongue that belied her small frame. She cooked, cleaned, and kept the inn running when travelers arrived. Locals from neighboring towns regarded the Mortons as outsiders. They rarely attended church gatherings, and Elias was said to prefer the solitude of the forest to conversation with neighbors. But business was business, and Hollow Creek filled a need. For 5 years, the inn remained unremarkable. Farmers, traders, and wanderers came and went. Some left behind stories of long conversations by the fire, of Clara's cornbread, or of the howling winds that rattled the shutters through the night. There was nothing yet to signal that Hollow Creek would become the subject of one of the most disturbing mysteries in the region's history. But then, in the fall of 1881, something changed. The first disappearance was almost easy to overlook. A merchant, John Whitaker, traveling south from Kentucky with a wagon load of goods. He was last seen at Hollow Creek Inn on a crisp October evening. Weeks later, his horse was found grazing freely in the foothills. His wagon and goods had vanished, along with Whitaker himself. At first, people assumed he had fallen victim to bandits. The mountains were known for outlaws who preyed on solitary travelers. But strangely, his family insisted, his trail stopped at Hollow Creek Inn, and beyond that, nothing more could be traced. Soon after, a young couple from Georgia vanished in strikingly similar circumstances. They were newlyweds, determined to carve out a new life farther west. Their wagon was spotted along the road days before they planned to stop for the night at Hollow Creek, but after they checked in, they disappeared entirely. Their families scoured the mountain paths, searched rivers and ravines, but all traces of them ended at the inn. By December, at least 5 names were whispered in farmhouses and saloons as victims of Hollow Creek's growing reputation. The pattern grew impossible to ignore. It wasn't one unfortunate accident. It wasn't mere coincidence. Someone was linked to that place, and yet when deputies arrived from the county seat to investigate, they found nothing. Elias Morton greeted them coldly but cooperatively. Clara cooked for the men, offered them ale, and maintained her innocence with polite composure. The inn's rooms were clean, the guest records written neatly in ink. There were no signs of struggle, no suspicious stains, no misplaced belongings. Every investigation ended the same, with no answers and no evidence that the Mortons were guilty of anything at all. But suspicion grew regardless. Families of the missing demanded justice. Passing travelers who had stayed the night and survived began to speak of a strange heaviness in the common room, of uneasy silence upstairs, and of the way Elias's eyes followed them too long, too intently. Some avoided the inn entirely, riding further through the night despite exhaustion, eager to put Hollow Creek behind them as quickly as possible. The towns nearby became divided. Some insisted that the Mortons were honest, hard-working people caught in unfortunate circumstances. Others swore that Hollow Creek Inn had become a trap, a place where travelers walked in unsuspecting and never walked out again. And so, by the end of 1881, Hollow Creek Inn was no longer just a roadside lodge. It had become a question without an answer, a shadow rising over the valley, a name spoken in hushed voices when riders warmed themselves by the fire. The disturbing cold case of Hollow Creek Inn, unsolved, unproven yet undeniably haunting, began here, on the road to Hollow Creek. But the story was far from over. For as more lives disappeared into its walls, the focus shifted from the missing travelers to the Mortons themselves. If one were to glance at the Hollow Creek Inn from the outside, there was little to suggest it was anything more than a lonely lodge pressed against the spine of the Tennessee mountains. But behind its narrow windows and within its timbered walls, all control over the inn and its secrets rested in the hands of the Mortons. Elias Morton, by every account, was a man of contradictions. Tall and broad, with dark eyes that held little warmth, he rarely offered more than a few words to passing travelers. His manners were polite but clipped, as though every word cost him effort. Townsfolk who passed through left, with the impression of a man whose thoughts were always elsewhere, far removed from the company he kept. He was known to rise before dawn, splitting wood or wandering into the forest with a rifle slung over his shoulder, returning hours later with little to show except muddy boots and silence. Clara Morton, by contrast, was far more visible. Barely 20, with auburn hair usually pulled back in a hurried knot, she shouldered much of the inn's visible work. She served meals, kept the fire burning, and exchanged pleasantries with stagecoach passengers when they came through. To many, her presence softened the inn's atmosphere. She even laughed on occasion, though never for long and never without Elias nearby watching. Neighbors, on the rare chance they spoke with her, remarked that Clara never seemed free of her brother's shadow. She did nothing without his approval. Some claimed Elias had always been protective of his sister, too protective. It was whispered that Clara had once been courted by a young farmer from a nearby valley. That farmer reportedly stopped arriving at church gatherings soon after. Just one more story swallowed by the growing myth that surrounded Hollow Creek. Their lives within the inn followed a rigid rhythm. Elias handled money, supplies and repairs. Clara tended to the guests, prepared food, and kept the rooms clean. The division of labor was set, almost rehearsed as though every day was a repetition of the last. Outside eyes might have called them hard-working. Inside whispers called them secretive. As disappearances unfurled in 1881, suspicion turned unavoidably toward the Mortons. Sheriff's deputies made their rounds more frequently, questioning them each time. Elias answered with short, factual statements. Clara offered polite smiles, claiming she remembered nothing unusual. And yet, one detail from those who investigated never failed to resurface. Guests had a tendency to vanish when the inn was nearly empty, when no other travelers could serve as witnesses. At the time, Hollow Creek seldom hosted more than 4 or 5 guests on a busy night. Most travelers used the main stage roads, leaving the remote inn to catch the stragglers, the desperate or those seeking silence. With so few witnesses, disappearances left little evidence, but stories spread. Stagecoach drivers began to warn passengers, stay one night if you must, but never 2. Traders advised each other to lock their rooms and never eat what wasn't taken directly from their own supplies. Families murmured about avoiding Hollow Creek altogether, even if it meant dangerous all-night rides through the mountains. Still, others defended the Mortons. Farmers passing through recalled friendly meals with Clara and respectful dealings with Elias. Some swore the siblings were incapable of violence. People vanish in these mountains all the time, they argued. Ravines, wild animals or bandits claimed countless lives. Why should the Mortons carry blame for tragedies common to the wilderness? Yet there was a strange pattern that Sheriff Billings himself could not ignore. Each of the missing left behind no trace, No bodies, no belongings, not even discarded gear found along the valley trails. For the families of the vanished, the cruel silence of evidence was unbearable. If they had died by accident, there should be something. Instead, their trail always stopped where they last laid their heads, Hollow Creek Inn. Then there were the accounts of those who left the inn alive. They spoke of strange habits that unsettled them. One traveler, arranging papers by lamplight, swore he saw Elias stand at the doorway for nearly a full minute, staring without a word, before quietly closing it again. Another recalled Clara's nervous glances, as if warning him silently to keep moving, to leave quickly. Some survivors even claimed they heard muffled noises at night, shuffling beneath the floorboards, doors opening when no one had stirred. But in a wooden inn creaking under mountain winds, such sounds could always be explained away. It was in December of 1881 that Sheriff Billings decided to press harder. He arrived unannounced with 3 deputies, determined to search the entire inn thoroughly. Elias gave little protest, though his jaw tightened at the intrusion. Clara prepared bread and stew for the deputies, as though it were a normal visit. For hours the lawmen searched every corner, beneath the floorboards, in the attic, even digging shallowly behind the shed. They found nothing, no blood, no bones, no belongings of the missing. The inn stood as ordinary as it ever had, its secrets, if they existed, locked away with walls that refused to betray truth, and yet suspicion didn't wane. It deepened, because sometimes the absence of proof is almost more damning than its presence. Locals began asking, how is it possible that so many vanish and nothing ever remains? The tension grew heavy between the Mortons and the nearest communities. Elias no longer came into town for supplies as often. He sent Clara instead. Clara, in turn, spoke less and less, her eyes fixed on the floor when asked questions. Rumors spread faster than the wind, rumors that Elias controlled not only the inn, but his sister as well. That Clara knew more than she dared to say. That the walls of Hollow Creek Inn held answers she was forbidden to reveal. As the new year approached, the story of Hollow Creek was no longer confined to mountain valleys. Letters reached counties further away. Newspapers began to pick up brief mentions of the disappearing travelers of Hollow Creek. The puzzle was now too large to ignore, and while lawmen demanded answers, and locals debated guilt or innocence, one truth settled firmly over all who spoke of it. The disappearances would not stop. For Hollow Creek Inn, in the cold shadow of the Tennessee ridges, was not finished with its guests. For every traveler who vanished within the shadow of Hollow Creek Inn, there were others, fewer but just enough, who passed through and lived to tell their stories. And it was these voices, scattered across nearby towns, that began to stitch together fragments of an unsettling picture. At first, their accounts seemed little more than oddities, tales told over whiskey in dimly lit taverns, or murmured across fences between neighbors. But as more vanished and fear spread, these recollections took on new weight. If taken seriously, they revealed patterns, a chilling consistency about the inn, Elias Clara, and the atmosphere inside those wooden walls. The first notable account came from a stagecoach passenger named Thomas Darby, a traveling salesman known for his sharp wit and sharper tongue. In November of 1881, Darby had stopped at Hollow Creek for a single night while en route to Knoxville. He later wrote of the experience in a letter to his wife, which was later found and shared when the disappearances grew notorious. Darby described entering the inn as stepping into a place half alive and half asleep. The fire burned. Clara moved about the kitchen, but he noticed an absence of sound. No birds perched on the roof. No dogs barking in the distance, only silence. He recalled that Elias barely spoke through the evening, watching him over the glow of the hearth. It was not the look of a host attending a guest, Darby wrote, but of a man weighing the worth of what stood before him. He left after breakfast the next morning, uneasy, relieved that his coach was waiting outside. Later, when word of the disappearances reached him, Darby insisted that if the coach had been delayed, he would not have stayed a second night for all the money in Tennessee. Another story came from a pair of loggers, men who had taken a detour to Hollow Creek after a long stint in the mountains. Tired and half-starved, they claimed Clara served them bread and stew, though she avoided eye contact and seemed hurried, distracted. During the night, the men swore they heard footsteps above them long after Elias and Clara had retired. The sound paced back and forth in the empty hall outside their room, steps that paused just beyond their door. One of the loggers, too unnerved to sleep, kept a hatchet beside him until dawn. When they awoke, they found no sign of anyone else staying at the inn. The memory haunted them. Both swore never to ride that route again, choosing instead to add days to their journey just to steer clear of Hollow Creek. Then there was the account of a farmer named Samuel Briggs, who stayed for one night with his young son while transporting livestock. Briggs later told deputies that Clara had been kind, offering warm milk for his boy, but in the quiet of the evening, he noticed her slip notes beneath Elias's hand when she thought their guest wasn't watching. Elias would glance at the message, then burn it immediately in the fire without a word. The act was subtle, deliberate, and repeated twice during the meal. Briggs remembered the way Clara closed her eyes quickly each time the paper burned, her hands trembling, as though she silently regretted what had just been destroyed. More accounts followed. A prospector swore he awoke to his doorknob rattling at midnight, though no one entered. A schoolteacher passing through claimed she heard faint cries while walking past the kitchen, though Clara quickly shushed her, insisting it was a goat outside. Each story on its own might have been dismissed as nerves, imagination, or tricks of mountain wind. But together, they painted an image of unease that matched the timeline of disappearances. Again and again, survivors emphasized certain details: Elias's steady, calculating gaze, Clara's nervous glances and quick movements, the silence that seemed unnatural, pressing in on every corner of the inn. What made their voices more compelling was not the consistency alone, but the fear that lingered in them even long after leaving Hollow Creek. Many of these travelers, hardened men and women used to frontier life, spoke of the inn with lowered voices, as though to give memory to it was to invite it back into the present. This growing collection of testimonies spread rapidly across communities, carried through stagecoach drivers, merchants, and families passing word along dirt roads. Fear began to transform into something larger: belief. Belief that within the shadow of Hollow Creek, something was terribly wrong. Local residents debated endlessly what the stories suggested. Some were convinced the Mortons were guilty, Elias as the hand of violence, Clara as the silent witness trapped under his control. Others whispered darker theories, things that strayed closer to superstition, that the land itself carried a curse, or that old crimes committed by the Morton family stained the inn beyond redemption. Lawmen could not rely on whispers, but public pressure mounted regardless. Sheriff Billings listened carefully to the survivors as he gathered reports. What disturbed him most was not what they had seen, but what they hadn't. No one once claimed to see another guest leave Hollow Creek alive after spending more than a single night there. The uncertainty fed the legend. Better to pass Hollow Creek by moonlight than risk its roof became a phrase muttered among those who traveled mountain roads. Fear grew strong enough that some stage routes were altered to avoid passing within sight of the inn altogether, and yet Hollow Creek Inn stood untouched. Elias and Clara remained hosts to those desperate enough to enter, always calm under questioning, always free of damning evidence. The law had no grounds for arrest, no weapon, no body, no proof, but the voices of the survivors carried further with each passing week. Their stories, pieced together over time, became something more than rumor. They became the backbone of the growing legend. That Hollow Creek was not an inn for travelers, but a snare, a place that chose who stayed, who left, and who disappeared entirely. And behind every recollection, one question grew louder and more terrifying. How long before someone remembered seeing survival? For the very last time? By the opening months of 1882, Hollow Creek Inn was no longer just a matter of local gossip. Its name, once nothing more than a waypoint in the Tennessee highlands, began to seep into voices and writings far beyond the mountain ridges. What had started as private speculation at hearths and taverns evolved into print on newspaper pages. Traveling by rail faster than any horse or stagecoach ever could, the first significant mention appeared in the Nashville Daily Press. It was a modest piece, buried among columns of news about trade disputes, weather forecasts, and political chatter. The article described a curious repetition of disappearances near a roadside inn in the Tennessee mountains. Though brief, it sparked intrigue. What made it notable was not the length, but the tone. The journalist dared to name Hollow Creek, attaching Elias and Clara Morton's surnames to the unsettling rumors. Once printed words gave shape to the whispers, those whispers took on new authority. Within weeks, other papers picked it up. The Knoxville Herald ran a more detailed account, citing at least 6 disappearances since autumn, and directly questioning why no formal charges had been brought against the Mortons. By spring, even newspapers as far as Atlanta and Richmond carried tidbits about the inn of vanishing guests. The more the story traveled, the less it resembled sober reporting, and the more it transformed into something approaching folklore. Taverns and boarding houses buzzed with versions of the tale. One barkeep in Chattanooga swore Hollow Creek Inn was built over an unmarked graveyard. A merchant in Asheville told anyone who would listen that Elias Morton was running a secret highwayman's den, disposing of bodies where no one could find them. And families, long before ever nearing the mountains themselves, cautioned travelers they knew. Avoid Hollow Creek if you value your life. The Mortons, meanwhile, remained curiously still amid the storm. Elias cut back his appearances in town. Clara took over supply runs, except in cases where payment required Elias's presence. Locals shifted their eyes as she passed, some with open suspicion, others with pity. Town gossip claimed she sometimes purchased twice the amount of ordinary provisions, extra sacks of flour, larger cuts of salted pork, far more than a handful of guests could consume. The suggestion was clear. These supplies fed not customers but something else hidden from plain sight. The press attention fueled increased pressure on Sheriff Billings. Angry letters poured into his office from families of the disappeared, some from counties away, each demanding harsher action. But Billings was a man bound by the weight of law. Without bodies, without belongings, without witnesses brave enough to accuse directly, his hands were tied. He scoured the inn yet again, this time with officials from a neighboring county. As with every visit, Hollow Creek yielded nothing but creaking floors, bare rooms, and walls reluctant to confess. And yet, the weight of reputation became heavier than any physical evidence could have been. Travelers who had once relied upon the inn's refuge abandoned it entirely. Stage routes adjusted, skirting the road where Hollow Creek stood, even when it cost more time and coin. Traders chose longer detours, swearing they'd rather lose days of profit than risk their lives inside the Mortons' walls. For an inn meant to thrive on the flow of wanderers, this sudden avoidance could easily spell its downfall. But strangely, the inn did not collapse. Despite the dwindling guest numbers, Elias continued to purchase supplies. Lamps burned in its windows most nights. Smoke drifted from its chimney. And every now and again, travelers, exhausted, caught by a storm or straying from safer paths, still passed through. Some returned. Others did not. What unsettled locals most was the pushing and pulling of rumor versus silence. For every man who claimed Hollow Creek housed thieves and killers, another claimed there was nothing more to see than an unfortunate string of accidents. After all, the mountains swallowed men whole long before 1881. Avalanches, floods, wolves and bandits took their toll year after year. To tie them all to Elias Morton was to mistake coincidence for conspiracy. At least that was what the more rational voices argued, but newspapers flourished more on sensation than logic. By the summer of 1882, Hollow Creek Inn was a fully formed legend on its own. Poets scribbled crude ballads about the inn where shadows feast. Political cartoonists mocked Tennessee lawmen for their inability to solve a case sold to the press as obvious. Papers even began to report unconfirmed body counts. As many as 12 lost to Hollow Creek, one clipping claimed, though only a half-dozen could be named with certainty. The mountain communities felt the crushing weight of outsiders' judgment. To them, Hollow Creek was not just a story. It was home, a place tangled in practical survival. And now, surrounding states treated the inn not as an isolated puzzle, but as a stain on all of Tennessee. For the Mortons, that stain became permanent, regardless of whether guilt ever touched them legally. To locals, the siblings were trapped not only within their inn, but within the suffocating expectations of outsiders, convinced that something savage lurked inside. Sheriff Billings lamented privately to a minister that the case was slipping from his hands. "The law sees no crime here," he confessed, "but the papers have already written one." That was the terrible reality. The court of public opinion had already convicted Hollow Creek Inn. Elias and Clara, whether guilty or innocent, were forever marked as caretakers of a place now symbolic of fear. As autumn approached once more, And the anniversary of the earliest disappearances drew near. Tension around the inn only deepened. Strangers now rode into the valley not merely to pass through, but to glimpse the place for themselves. Curiosity seekers, inspired by endless articles, sought to stand in its shadow. Some asked for a tour. Others begged to stay the night, daring fate itself. But even the boldest did not remain long within its walls. The legend had grown larger than Elias and Clara, larger than Sheriff Billings or the missing guests. Hollow Creek Inn was no longer just a wooden lodge set against the mountains. It had become a story carried miles away, past county lines, past rivers, across states, a tale retold until truth and imagination intertwined so completely no one could separate one from the other. But as curiosity rose, so too did danger. For not every visitor came seeking safety or stories. Some arrived with harder eyes, with motives closer to vengeance. To them, proof no longer mattered. The inn had become guilty by reputation alone, and as fresh travelers disappeared that autumn, the line between suspicion and certainty blurred further than ever before. Hollow Creek Inn was a name no one could ignore anymore. Its legend had crossed mountains, and there would be no turning back. By late 1882, Hollow Creek Inn had become less of an inn and more of a spectacle. No longer just a roadside stop, it now carried a reputation that drew outsiders like moths to flame. The missing travelers had transformed the building from a weary lodge into a place of fascination, where reality blurred with legend, and legend brought dangerous visitors to its doorstep. Some came merely to look, to satisfy curiosity sparked by sensational headlines. Farmers, merchants, and families passing through would detour from main roads just to lay eyes on the inn. They would stop at the bend where the valley dipped, pointing across mist and pines toward the weather-beaten structure. They never approached closer, but the sight alone was enough. Confirmation that the place was real, that it stood exactly as described in whispers. Parents warned their children to memorize its silhouette, a landmark not to be approached under any circumstance. Others, however, arrived with darker intent. Journalists armed with notebooks and eager for stories came seeking access. Some knocked boldly at the door, asking Elias and Clara to allow them inside for sketches and descriptions that would later sell thousands of copies. Elias turned them away every time. "No papers in my house," he snapped more than once, leaving Clara to apologize with weak smiles. But the rejections only fueled the fire, because the less the press was shown, the more they speculated. Far more troubling were the men who came not for stories, but for vengeance. By then, families of the vanished had heard enough. It no longer mattered whether proof existed. In their grief, Elias and Clara represented everything taken from them. Husbands, wives, sons, daughters lost on mountain roads. A group of armed men from Georgia is said to have ridden into the valley one evening, threatening to burn down Hollow Creek once and for all. Billings and his deputies intercepted them before violence broke loose. Yet even the sheriff confessed afterward that trouble like this could not be held off forever. Fortune hunters also emerged, men who believed the inn concealed loot. They were convinced Elias ran a den of robbery, killing travelers and hiding stolen valuables somewhere on the grounds. These desperate seekers prowled nearby trails at night, digging in rocky soil or prying at loose planks when they thought no one was watching. If the Mortons noticed, they said nothing. But witnesses insisted Elias often stood on the porch with a rifle propped against his shoulder, silent, watchful, until the trespassers retreated. For Clara, the pressure became unbearable. Each time she ventured into town for supplies, whispers burned at her back. Some women refused to sell her cloth or sugar, crossing themselves as she walked by. Children taunted her from alleyways, chanting crude rhymes about the inn that ate its guests. A few sympathetic voices reached her too, neighbors who pitied her situation, assuming she lived under Elias's stern control. But sympathy was no shield. Clara's shoulders slouched lower with each passing month, her eyes fixed increasingly on the ground. Elias responded differently. If the world pressed harder, he pressed harder still. He barricaded the inn with stronger locks, reinforced windows, and a constant vigilance that gave travelers pause. Guests who managed to stay described the suffocating atmosphere not only of silence but of surveillance. Elias's gaze never rested. Even while Clara served meals, his presence lingered heavy in the doorway, calculating, sizing up each movement. By now, the number of guests had dwindled to a trickle. Hollow Creek, once a place of modest profit, had become a failing enterprise. Yet, strangely, Elias never closed its doors. Why maintain a business with so few customers? Why continue purchasing more supplies than two siblings could consume? These questions only fueled the rumors further. Even Sheriff Billings admitted his patience was wearing thin. The rising tide of attention drew unwanted chaos into his county. Deputies were now spending more time quelling brawls between vengeful families and stubborn locals than pursuing actual criminals. The Mortons, Billings noted grimly, may not be guilty of the crimes they're accused of, but they've brought danger here all the same. As autumn fog returned to drape the mountains in grey, Hollow Creek Inn's isolation grew sharper. Fewer travelers approached, but those who did became increasingly unpredictable. Some came with guns, daring Elias to step outside. Others taunted Clara with questions, insisting she confess. A few reckless souls demanded to stay inside, to spend a night just to prove the legend wrong. Most of these bold visitors left alive. A few did not. And each time someone disappeared anew, the spiral tightened further. Rumors shifted from speculation into conviction. Elias Morton was no host. He was a killer, keeping Hollow Creek alive by feeding it lives. Around tavern tables, theories grew increasingly grotesque. Some said bodies were buried deep in the root cellars. Others believed Elias dragged corpses into the ravines, feeding wolves and leaving no trace. One rumor whispered that Clara herself prepared the guests' meals with poison, bound by fear of her brother's commands. Nonsense or not, such tales carried weight. Tales could kill almost as easily as rifles, and Elias knew it. To some, his anger grew more visible. He barked at trespassers, shouted at deputies who dared return, and, according to one witness, slammed his fist so hard on the front counter that Clara jumped from the sound. But perhaps the most chilling transformation was the utter stillness Hollow Creek carried when travelers rode past without stopping. Smoke curled from its chimney. A solitary figure stood in the yard, sharpening a blade or chopping wood. And in the distance, folk whispered, the windows seemed too dark, as though the building itself was watching. By the end of 1882, Hollow Creek Inn was no longer just a story, it was a storm. Curiosity had brought journalists. Vengeance had brought armed men. Greed had brought treasure hunters. None of them left the Mortons untouched. And as the stage was set for the following winter, more disappearances loomed, deeper suspicions rose, and the fragile boundary between justice and chaos thinned dangerously. For many, it was only a matter of time before Hollow Creek's walls gave up their secrets, or burned with them still inside. By the winter of 1883, pressure on law enforcement could no longer be ignored. Hollow Creek Inn was no longer just a rumor circulated in smoky taverns. It was by then a full-blown scandal. Families in Tennessee and beyond demanded answers. Newspapers mocked the authorities' failures, and whispers of vigilantism hovered dangerously close to action. Sheriff Billings, weary and tested, finally set into motion a larger, more coordinated investigation. This time, he brought not only his own deputies but also investigators from a neighboring county, and even a hired detective from Nashville, a man named Charles Redford, known for solving several notorious bandit killings. If proof of foul play existed at the inn, Redford vowed he would find it. The expedition set out in February, trudging through deep snow and icy winds toward Hollow Creek Inn. Unlike previous surprise checks, this was a deliberate operation. Wagons carried shovels, lanterns, hounds, and enough men to thoroughly scour every inch of the property. The valley's residents looked on with nervous anticipation, convinced that at last, the inn's secrets would be dragged into daylight. When Elias opened the door to the lawman, his expression betrayed no surprise. Some said his face remained blank as ever. Others swore the corner of his mouth curled slightly, as if welcoming a challenge he had long expected. Clara stood behind him, pale as snow, her hands wringing the hem of her apron. Two deputies kept watch of the siblings, while Billings, Redford, and the others began their work. They searched every room upstairs. Beds were torn apart, seams ripped open, floorboards lifted with crowbars. Downstairs the hearth was cleared, ashes sifted through fine mesh sieves. In the storage cellars, barrels of salt pork and root vegetables were rolled aside, dirt scraped and overturned in search of hidden remains. The hounds sniffed every corner, every foundation stone, yet barked at nothing more alarming than stale ale and firewood. Behind the inn, teams of men dug into frozen earth, probing for shallow graves. The blades of their shovels rang hollow against frozen stone and clay. They found nothing. Hours turned into days. For nearly a week, the investigators camped near the inn, working under lantern light through freezing nights. They explored the nearby ravine, suspicion high that bodies could have been tossed into the rushing creek below. Yet the water's fierce current refused to yield any remains. When tempers flared among deputies, Redford called for patience. "Hollow Creek hides something," he insisted. "It's too consistent, too exact for chance, but it's not giving itself up easily." Yet even the seasoned detective could not deny what each fruitless day made clearer. There were no bodies, no belongings, no bloodied tools or traces of violence. Hollow Creek Inn stood as always, silent and unbroken against accusation. The Mortons, for their part, maintained their composure. Elias answered questions with calm economy, neither defensive nor apologetic. Clara kept to the background, fixing meals for the men, her hands trembling as she ladled stew. Some deputies muttered uneasily that she looked like a prisoner, not a sister. Others claimed her silence was the strongest proof of guilt, that she knew but lacked the courage to speak. By the investigation's end, the frustration was palpable. The men had torn up the inn, razed outbuildings, combed streams, and left no corridor unexplored. And yet they left empty-handed, carrying back to townsfolk not the evidence they demanded, but only disappointment. The failure of this grand search struck the region deeply. For the families of the missing, it was almost unbearable. Hopes that their loved ones' fates would be uncovered dissolved into bitter dust. For the Mortons, their continued apparent innocence did nothing to lessen suspicion. If anything, surviving yet another exhaustive investigation cemented them further in legend. Untouchable, unbreakable, provoking endless questions. Were they cunning, or were they simply blameless? Sheriff Billings, once confident that law and persistence could resolve the matter, admitted later that the Hollow Creek case had broken his spirit. "Either the ground itself swallows men here," he muttered to one deputy, "or evil has learned how to wear skin we cannot pierce." The press predictably thrived on the outcome. Instead of silencing rumor, the failed investigation poured fuel onto the fire. Headlines mocked the inadequacy of the search. "The Devil's Inn defies the law," one broadside read in bold letters. Another simply declared, "As many lost as ever, no truth found." The silence of Hollow Creek had become louder than any revelation, and so the inn remained, standing unshaken amid the storm. The Mortons kept to their rhythm, Elias chopping wood in the yard, Clara passing through town with lowered eyes. The smoke rose nightly from the chimney, as if nothing unusual had ever taken place beneath its roof. But for the valley community, everything had changed. Fear turned to dread, and dread to an odd kind of acceptance. Perhaps the truth of Hollow Creek could never be brought to earth. It seemed no law could uproot its secrets, and in that void of answers, as snow thawed and the mountains awoke to spring, travelers still went missing. Not many, but enough. Enough to keep the story breathing. Enough to remind the valley that Hollow Creek Inn was not through yet. The official search had failed, and because of that, what followed grew darker still. By the winter of 1885, Hollow Creek Inn was no longer simply a place. It was a battleground of rumor, fear, and vengeance. The years of whispers, disappearances, and failed investigations had built toward a breaking point. The inn stood dark against the snow, its windows like watchful eyes, and for many in the valley, only one conclusion remained. Hollow Creek could not stand any longer. The final spark came in January, when two brothers, farmhands from North Carolina traveling west, were last seen entering the inn. Their horses turned up later, riderless, grazing near the foothills. No trace of the brothers was found. This disappearance tore through the county like a storm. Two men, young, strong, known by family across state lines. This was a disappearance that could not be waved away. Newspaper columns thundered with outrage. Politicians, now under intense scrutiny, demanded that justice no longer be delayed. Rumors flared that Elias had turned bolder, more careless, taking guests with less hesitation. Sheriff Billings, by now deeply weary, confessed that the situation had slipped beyond his control. Mob fury dwarfed his deputy's strength, and when word spread that more men were gathering, dozens, some from out of state. The sheriff realized the inn's fate was sealed. The night of confrontation arrived in February. The valley was cloaked in snow and mist, yet the road to Hollow Creek blazed with torches as nearly 100 men gathered. They came armed with rifles, shotguns, and axes. Many were farmers and laborers. Some were grieving fathers and brothers. A few were simply opportunists, eager for violence or the satisfaction of seeing legend collapse in fire. From the porch, Elias awaited. He stood with his rifle at hand, shoulders squared against the bitter wind. Clara was at his side, ashen-faced, her eyes shimmering with terror, but refusing to leave the doorway. The crowd stopped short of the porch, the torches casting wild, flickering light over the inn's weathered boards. Murmurs ran through their ranks, anger barely restrained by the frosted air. Then a man called forward, voice thick with grief, "You've taken our sons, our brothers. No law saved them, and no law will save you." Elias said nothing. His silence was more infuriating than words. The mob pressed closer, shouts breaking out, demands for confession, for blood, for fire. Some raised their rifles. For a heartbeat, it seemed as though flames might engulf the place at once. Clara, trembling, whispered something. Some said it was, "Stop, Elias." Not like this, but Elias did not move. His eyes swept the crowd with the same hard, unblinking stare survivors had spoken of for years. Finally, his voice cut through the noise. "No proof, no graves. You want to bury me without either? Then do it." The words did nothing to calm the mob. If anything, they struck like oil on flame. Shouts grew louder. "Burn it! Boti blood for blood! Justice!" Torches lifted high, fire blazing against the dark winter fog. Sheriff Billings, desperate, tried to intervene once more. He rode ahead, demanding calm, insisting that law, not rage, prevail. But his words were drowned out. The mob's fury had grown over years, and that night it could no longer be contained. The first torch struck the inn's porch rail, flames catching dry wood. In moments, fire spread, licking upward with hungry speed. Clara cried out, clutching Elias's arm, but he held still, glaring out over the crowd as the walls around him began to glow with heat and ash. Witnesses later swore his face softened not in fear, but in grim resignation, acceptance, as if he had known this end all along. Some claimed Elias fired a warning shot above the mob before the flames reached the roof. Others insisted he lowered his rifle, refusing to give them the satisfaction. Accounts vary, but what all agreed upon was this: the crowd did not rush in to pull them out. They watched. They let the fire claim Hollow Creek Inn, its roof collapsing in a roar of sparks and smoke. The flames burned through the night, visible for miles across the valley. By dawn, Hollow Creek Inn was nothing but ruins, charred timbers, ashen stone, and smoke twisting into the sky. When the embers cooled, men searched the remains. What they found would haunt the legend forever. No bones, no bodies. Neither Elias Morton nor his sister Clara were ever recovered from the ashes. Some swore this confirmed guilt. The siblings had escaped into the wilderness, slipping away under the cover of fire. Others claimed the flames consumed them utterly, leaving no trace. A few whispered the inn itself had devoured them, as it had devoured so many before. Whatever truth existed, it was gone with the smoke. The ruin stood black and silent for years afterward, a scar on the valley. No one rebuilt, no one farmed near it. Travelers avoided the spot where Hollow Creek once stood, crossing themselves as they passed the charred stone foundation. Sheriff Billings, broken by what had happened, resigned within the year. "The truth was never fetched out," he said, "and maybe it never can be. But Hollow Creek Inn had left its mark, not only on the mountain valley, but on all of Tennessee. Its story carried in song, in print, in whispers still told when night falls heavy. It had ended in fire, but not in closure, and in some ways the inn had never ended at all. The fire of February 1885 consumed the Hollow Creek Inn, but did not consume its story. In truth, the flames only sharpened the legend, burning its outlines into the memory of every man, woman, and child who lived in the Tennessee mountains, and many who had never set foot there. In the weeks that followed, the blackened ruins drew visitors like a shrine. Locals gathered, some to marvel, some to pray, others to spit in the ashes. Survivors of the vanished traveled from neighboring counties and stood in grim silence, staring at the charred timbers, whispering the names of loved ones lost. Whatever answers they had hoped to find in molten rubble were never uncovered. no bones. No clothing, no keepsakes, nothing that proved the Mortons had perished, nor anything to prove they had ever been guilty. The absence of their remains became yet another question, one that deepened rather than ended the mystery. For some, the explanation was simple. Elias and Clara slipped away before the mob arrived, using the chaos of fire to vanish into the wilderness. These believers claimed the siblings lived out their days under assumed names. Perhaps in Kentucky or Missouri, their guilt concealed beneath new lives. For others, the fire had sealed the inn's appetite. Just as it had swallowed guests and left no trace, it had swallowed Elias and Clara themselves. To them, Hollow Creek was not a stage for crime. It was the crime. A place cursed from its foundation, dragging all into silence. Either way, the truth had gone up with the smoke. In Nashville, newspapers ran triumphant headlines: "The Valley purged, Hollow Creek in ashes." To the public, the fire was resolution, the mob was justice, and the Mortons, guilty or not, were gone. But in the Valley, resolution did not come so easily. Sheriff Billings resigned that same summer, confessing privately that the Hollow Creek case had destroyed his faith in law. "Justice can't stitch a wound made by shadows," he told a minister before leaving. "When truth hides too deep, people carve their own answers." And that's what they did. He moved away, never speaking of Hollow Creek again. The land itself seemed reluctant to recover. The blackened foundation stood for years, weeds sprouting through scorched stone. Children dared each other to touch it, whispering they could still feel the heat of the fire. Travelers avoided the site at all costs, steering wagons wide around the valley bend rather than pass too near. By the 1890s, Hollow Creek Inn had become more story than memory. The songs began, folk ballads sung by miners and loggers, of travelers who entered an inn and never left, of a sister bound in silence, of a man with a rifle and eyes like stone. Soon the ballads traveled farther than the valley ever had, winding their way through Appalachia, reshaped with each telling. Some versions made Elias a highwayman who killed for gold. Others cast Clara as the secret villain, poisoning meals while guests sang hymns in ignorance. Still others turned the inn into something beyond men altogether, where the land itself devoured strangers, leaving no echo but fire. Each retelling blurred truth further, but the families who had lost loved ones were never convinced by songs. To them, the pain was not folklore. It was hollow chairs, broken kin, names carved on markers with no grave beneath them. For them, the ruins remained a wound gouged deep in the mountain's history, never healed, never answered. And so Hollow Creek became two things at once: a legend for those who sought stories, and a scar for those who remembered. Even decades later, when steam engines replaced stagecoaches and telegraphs replaced letters, mention of Hollow Creek carried weight. Travelers heading through the Tennessee highlands in the early 20th century swore locals still crossed themselves when asked about the inn. Old men in taverns fell silent when pressed for details, as though the very words might summon the past back into being. In time, the valley itself grew empty. The road that once carried wagons was abandoned, reclaimed by forest and stone. Only fragments of foundation remained, covered in vines and moss. To anyone passing by, they looked like no more than ruins of some forgotten homestead. But to those who knew the story, every vine, every stone, carried memory as sharp as blood. The disturbing case of Hollow Creek Inn never found answers. No proof ever surfaced to confirm Elias and Clara's guilt. No bones were ever recovered of the vanished travelers. No confession was spoken, no closure granted. It was a riddle left half-written, carved into silence, sealed in fire. And that silence proved more powerful than truth itself, because when a mystery is left unanswered, it does not die, it grows. With time, the Hollow Creek Inn became not just history but myth, their story whispered by firelight, retold by generations who never knew Elias Morton or his sister, but felt the weight of their legend. In the end, Hollow Creek Inn was not remembered as a building, or even as the Mortons' business. It was remembered as a question, haunting, unresolved, eternal. A question that hung over the Tennessee mountains like fog. What truly happened to the guests who never left? Have you noticed how every family hides secrets that seem to whisper from the past? Here, we uncover buried stories, family curses, and mysteries many would rather silence. But if you've made it this far, It means you feel that same chilling curiosity that holds you captive. Don't let these voices fade away. Subscribe to the channel now, turn on the bell, and follow each new case we bring every week. Join a community that isn't afraid to face the darkest side of history. Get ready, the next secrets are already waiting to be told.